The early morning sun over Fort Kessler didn't rise, it simply intruded. It burned through the haze of the Wyoming dawn, baking the dust of the training grounds before the dew had even fully evaporated. The air smelled of diesel, stale sweat, and the distinct metallic tang of aggression that always seemed to hover over Bravo Squad. It was 0600 hours, and the heat was already oppressive, pressing down on the shoulders of 40 recruits standing in formation. But the heat wasn't the only thing making the air heavy. There was a tension in the ranks, a sharp, jagged edge centered around one figure standing slightly apart from the rest. "Nice bruises, princess. Didn't know Fort Kessler had spa days." The voice sliced through the humid morning air like a dull, rusted blade. It belonged to Private Wade Huxley. He stood with his chest puffed out, a smirk plastered across his face that was loud enough to be heard 3 rows back. He stepped back into line, but his eyes remained fixed on his target, gleaming with the satisfaction of a bully who thinks he has found easy prey. That was the point of the comment. It wasn't just to insult, it was a performance. Huxley thrived on an audience, and in Bravo Squad, silence was often mistaken for submission. Sergeant Grace Mallerie stood alone on the open expanse of the training field. She was a striking contrast to the fresh-faced, arrogant energy of the recruits behind her. Her gray tank top was soaked through with sweat, clinging to a frame that was lean, corded with muscle, and visibly battered. Dust clung to her skin like a second uniform, turning her tan combat boots a shade of pale gray. But it was the bruises that drew the eye, and Huxley's mockery. They bloomed across her arms in violently colorful constellations of purple, yellow, and sickly green. They ran down her collarbone, disappearing beneath the fabric of her shirt, suggesting a canvas of pain that extended far beyond what was visible. These weren't the kind of bruises you got from bumping into a doorframe or taking a bad fall during an obstacle course run. These were deep tissue traumas. These were the kind of marks you earn slowly, violently, and at great cost. Her knuckles were raw, the skin split and scabbing over. Her gait, as she had walked to her position, was just slightly off, a microscopic limp that hinted at a hip or knee injury she was forcing her body to ignore. Yet, her posture was unshaken. She stood at ease, hands clasped behind her back, staring at a point on the horizon that only she could see. Behind her, the unit shifted. The contagious nature of cruelty rippled through the ranks. Some chuckled quietly, hiding their smiles behind coughed laughs. Others watched her with detached amusement, grateful that for once the target wasn't them. Grace was new here. She was technically the only female assigned to Bravo Squad in the last 2 years, an anomaly in a system that thrived on uniformity. She had arrived with no introduction, no backstory, and no rank insignia on her PT gear. All anyone knew was that she had been transferred in on a special directive, a bureaucratic term that usually meant someone was being shuffled around to hide a mistake. Whispers had floated around the barracks the night before, fueled by boredom and speculation. Some said she was recovering from a training accident at a cushy base in Germany. Others claimed she was just another paper pusher from the Pentagon trying to prove she could run with the grunts for a promotion packet. The rumors were varied, but they all shared a common theme. She didn't belong here. Grace didn't say a word. She didn't flinch at Huxley's voice. She didn't even blink as the sweat rolled down her temple. That bothered Huxley more than he would ever admit. Silence is a mirror, and when you scream into it and get nothing back, you start to see your own insecurity reflecting. "How many push-ups does it take to snap a wrist, Sarge?" Huxley continued, emboldened by her lack of response. He flashed a lazy, predatory grin at the man next to him. "Or did you trip over your own ego again?" The snickering grew louder. It was the kind of laughter that tests boundaries, the sound of a pack sensing weakness. None of them really knew her, and in the absence of truth, people get bold. They fill the void with their own narratives, usually ones that make them feel superior. What they didn't know, what none of them even considered in their wildest estimations, was that this woman hadn't asked to come back to Fort Kessler. She wasn't here for rehab. She wasn't here for a career checkmark. She had volunteered. She was here not because she needed redemption, but because she owed a debt only she understood, a debt paid in blood and memory. From a small grassy rise just beyond the perimeter of the dirt field, General Thomas Barkley stood watching. His hands were clasped firmly behind his back, his expression unreadable behind a pair of standard-issue aviators. He had known the moment she stepped out of the Humvee that morning that this wouldn't be easy. Grace Mallerie never sought attention. She despised it. And yet, wherever she went, the weight of history followed her like a shadow. The general watched the scene unfold with a clinical, almost cold detachment. He saw Huxley's posturing. He saw the unit's disrespect. He saw the isolation of the woman standing in the dust. Still, he didn't intervene. Not yet. He needed to see if the squad would correct itself. He needed to see if there was any leadership among them before he stepped in to provide it. Grace stood in the heat, silent and still, while the bruises along her neck, half-healed, still angry and red, caught the harsh morning sun. She didn't defend herself. She didn't look away or cast a glare at Huxley. Grace Mallerie knew something the rest of them didn't. She knew that respect earned in silence lasts longer than applause gained by shouting. She looked like someone who had been through hell, and some of the smarter recruits were already starting to wonder if maybe, just maybe, she hadn't made it all the way back. The scar beneath her left eye shimmered faintly in the light. It was thin, uneven, almost surgical, dragging the skin slightly. Her shoulders were squared, but her stillness wasn't born of pride or arrogance. It was something quieter. It was the stillness of a predator that has already eaten, or perhaps the stillness of a statue that has weathered a hurricane. It was old. Then the general spoke. "Call sign, Widow 27. His voice was not loud, but it carried across the field like a warning wrapped in gravel. It cut through the chatter, the snickering, and the wind. It was the voice of a man who didn't need to shout to be obeyed. Everything stopped. The laughter died in throats. The sideways glances froze. The smirks fell away. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath, sensing a shift in the atmospheric pressure of the platoon. Private Huxley blinked, caught off guard. He turned his head slightly, half confused, half annoyed at the interruption of his show. "Widow? What?" General Barkley stepped off the rise. His boots met the dirt with a slow, measured rhythm. Thud, thud, thud. He walked with the heavy grace of a tank. His arms were no longer behind his back. They were down at his sides, fists gently, dangerously clenched. He walked straight past the formation lines, ignoring the other instructors. His eyes locked on the loudmouth in the third row. "You just ran your mouth at Widow 27, son." The field didn't just go quiet. It tightened. It constricted like a noose. Every man standing there suddenly felt like they had been roped into something they didn't understand, something volatile. Somewhere near the back of the formation, Private Keller, a kid from Arizona with 5 older brothers in the service and a head full of military trivia, let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. His face went pale. "No way," he whispered to himself, the words barely audible. "That's her?" Next to him, another cadet's eyes widened, catching the fear in Keller's tone. They had heard the name. Not in official briefings, but in the stories passed around like ghost tales during night watch in basic training. Widow 27. It wasn't a call sign, it was a myth. It was a name whispered when talking about the worst deployment nightmares, the missions that don't make the evening news. She was the woman who went dark on comms for 5 days in the Hindu Kush, only to re-emerge dragging a bleeding squad mate through enemy fire. But that was a legend, an exaggeration cooked up to scare fresh recruits. It couldn't be this woman. It couldn't be this bruised, silent figure standing in front of them with dust in her messy bun and blood still crusted on her collar from a wound none of them could see. Was it? Barkley stopped just a few feet from Huxley. He looked the private over like a slow-forming storm, inspecting a structure he was about to demolish. The silence stretched out, agonizingly long. "You don't need to understand what it means," Barkley said softly, his voice dangerously low. "But you'd better damn well remember it." Behind Grace, one of the older drill instructors, a man who had served in the Rangers, slowly stood at attention. He didn't do it because protocol demanded it. He did it because something inside him, some instinct honed by combat, said he should. And for the first time since she arrived, a shift rippled through the formation. It wasn't just silence now, it was recognition. The air had changed from mockery to uncertainty. "Have you ever heard of Operation Ghostline?" Barkley's voice was calm. Too calm. It was the quiet right before the levee breaks. Private Huxley didn't answer at first. He was trying to gauge if this was still about him, if he could laugh this off. But looking into the general's eyes, he realized the comedy hour was over. "No, sir," Huxley finally muttered, his bravado leaking out of him like air from a punctured tire. The general turned just slightly. He wasn't addressing Huxley anymore. He was addressing the rest of them, to the field that had gone dead still. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. The story he was about to tell carried its own volume. 4 years ago, a 7-person recon unit was dropped behind the land divide, Barkley began. Remote, cold, hostile. They were sent in to confirm intel on a weapons facility we weren't supposed to know existed in a region where we weren't supposed to be. He paused. He didn't pause for dramatic effect. He paused because saying it still cost him something. The memory of that operation was a black mark in the classified files, a ghost that haunted the command center. What should have taken 48 hours turned into 8 days. A few recruits shifted quietly, the sound of boots scraping dirt sounding incredibly loud. "They were ambushed on day 2, Barkley continued, his eyes scanning the faces of the young men. 2 gone instantly, snipers. 1 bled out before sunrise the next day. 1 vanished during the firefight, never recovered. That left 3. The wind picked up again gently, swirling the dust around Grace's boots, but she remained immobile. She was listening, but she wasn't there. She was 4 years ago. She was thousands of miles away. 1 had shrapnel embedded so deep in his chest he could barely breathe without coughing up blood, Barkley narrated, painting the grim picture. Another, their comms specialist, was knocked unconscious in the blast, suffering a severe concussion. He let the silence settle, heavy and suffocating. And the last, Barkley gestured slightly toward Grace, she was shot through the thigh. 2 fractured ribs from the impact of a fall. No painkillers, no evac. Just 12 miles of ice, jagged rock, and shadow between her and the only extraction point that offered a 10% chance of survival. The general's eyes returned to Grace. She hadn't flinched, not once. "She carried the comms guy on her back," Barkley said, enunciating every word. "She dragged the wounded one on a makeshift sled rigged from broken pack straps and a snapped rifle barrel. No backup, no air support, just grit and the refusal to die. The unit was silent. You could hear the distant hum of a generator, the cry of a hawk, but nothing from the 40 men in formation. But Grace was somewhere else. Back then, there was no formation. There were no lines. There was no Huxley mouthing off. There was just blood in the snow. Snow that wasn't white, but pink with frozen mist. There was just the sound of her own breath getting shorter every hour, the screaming agony in her leg with every step, and a voice barely alive behind her, whispering, "Leave me, just go." And her own voice, raspy and broken, replying, "If I pass out, don't stop. Just wake me up." She had kept walking, even when her vision blurred into gray tunnels, even when she had to crawl the last 300 yards with a grown man strapped to her back because standing had stopped being an option physically. She crawled until her knees were stripped of skin, leaving a trail of red across the ice. Now, standing under the Wyoming sun, Grace's hands were clenched so tight her nails were digging into her palms. Not out of anger, but because even now, even here in the safety of the base, the ghost hadn't let go. The cold still lived in her bones. Barkley's voice cut through her memory, bringing the squad back to the present. "You think she came back for glory?" he asked the unit, his eyes scanning them with disdain. "You think she kept moving for a medal?" She came back because not everyone who walks out of fire leaves the fire behind. And for the first time, even the boldest among them looked away. Because what they just heard wasn't a war story. It was a warning. It was a wound that never really closed, being opened up in front of them. For the first time, even the loudest ones lowered their eyes. Not in fear, not in guilt, but in something far more rare on a training field: respect. Sergeant Grace Mallerie stood motionless, hands behind her back, boots planted. The sun was higher now, catching the thin sheen of sweat on her neck. She still hadn't said a word, but the silence had shifted. This time, it didn't isolate her. It elevated her. She was no longer the outcast. She was the monolith. General Barkley exhaled through his nose, slow and steady, as if settling something heavy on the ground. "You think command sent her here?" He scanned the formation again. Cadets were now standing straighter, breathing slower, their chests puffed out, not in arrogance, but in an attempt to look worthy of being on the same field. "You think this was some reassignment?" Barkley challenged them. "Some favor? Some pity transfer for a broken soldier?" Barkley took a few steps, pausing directly in front of the unit, eye level with the front row. Sergeant Grace Mallerie had every right to walk away. She could have taken the medical discharge. She could have gone home with honors, with full clearance, with a pension, and no one, not a single soul in the Pentagon, would have questioned it. He waited a beat, long enough for the weight of those words to drop into their minds. But she didn't. His voice sharpened, not louder, just firmer, like steel striking flint. She asked to come back. Several cadets shifted. Ree, the youngest recruit, actually blinked like he'd misheard. Why would anyone go through that and ask for more? Not to sit behind a desk, Barkley clarified. Not to write reports or pose for recruitment posters or consult on movies. She asked for the hardest assignment we have: field instructor for pre-deployment cadets. That means you. He didn't need to say the rest. Every person standing there now realized the magnitude of their mistake. This wasn't some battered soldier trying to hang on to a past life. This was a leader who chose to come back to teach the next generation, not with stories, but with scars. She was here to ensure that when they were in the cold, when they were bleeding, they would know what to do. Barkley's tone softened, just a hair. She didn't return because she had to. She returned because she remembers what happens when training fails. She remembers the cost of being unprepared. No one spoke. No one needed to. Because sometimes leadership doesn't come wrapped in medals or fanfare or loud speeches. Sometimes it looks like a woman with bruised arms, a tight jaw, and fire in her silence. Sometimes it looks like the person you mocked 5 minutes ago. And in that moment, Barkley said, his voice almost a whisper now, the squad no longer saw her as the one who got sent here. They saw her as exactly who she was, the one who volunteered, the one who endured, the one you shut your damn mouth and learned from. He turned back to Huxley, who looked like he wanted the earth to swallow him whole. "You've got a legend standing right in front of you," Barkley said, finalizing the lesson, "and you didn't even know it." General Barkley's words still echoed when Private Huxley walked off the field 20 minutes later. His head was down, shoulders low. There was no swagger left, no performance, just silence following him like a long, dark shadow. No one clapped, no one sneered. And that silence was louder than any noise Huxley had ever made. Later that evening, the mess hall buzzed in its usual rhythm, but the frequency was different. Trays clattered, silverware scraped against plastic, but something had shifted in the atmosphere of Fort Kessler. Nobody laughed too loud. Nobody filled the air with nonsense or bragging. The usual chaotic energy of young men full of adrenaline was subdued, replaced by a thoughtful heaviness. In the back corner, at a round table meant for 6, Sergeant Grace Mallerie sat alone. She had the same posture as she did on the field, upright, vigilant. She ate slowly, methodically, like someone who viewed food as fuel rather than enjoyment. She looked like someone who didn't expect company and didn't need it. She was used to the solitude. Perhaps she even preferred it. It was safer. Until, one by one, they came. There was no fanfare. No one stood on a table to make a speech, just quiet footsteps on the linoleum floor. A plastic tray set down gently. A younger recruit, Ree, sat down first. He didn't ask for permission, but his movements were hesitant, respectful. Then another cadet joined. Then 2 more. Within minutes, the empty seats around her were filled. None of them said a word. They didn't say sorry. They didn't say we were wrong. Words were cheap, and they knew it. They just sat. They ate. And every few moments, their eyes glanced her way. Not with the pity they had felt that morning, and certainly not with the mockery. They looked at her with recognition. Because now they saw her. Not the bruises, not the silence, not the myth of Widow 27, but the woman who didn't break even when the world gave her every excuse to shatter. The soldier who didn't brag about war stories, didn't demand to be saluted, didn't need to be praised. She earned it quietly, brutally, completely. A few seats down, Private Keller, the one who had known the rumors, leaned in. He hesitated, knowing he was breaching the wall of silence she had built. His voice was barely above a whisper, trembling slightly. "Why Widow 27, Sergeant?" Grace stopped chewing. She didn't look up from her tray immediately. She took a breath, and for a second, the mess hall seemed to fade away. She wasn't seeing the mashed potatoes or the plastic fork. She was seeing faces, 26 faces. Some smiling, some screaming, some sleeping. She looked up, her eyes locking onto the young privates. They were eyes that had seen the end of the world and come back. "Because I've buried 26 of my team," she said, her voice even, devoid of theatricality. "I'm number 27. The table went still. The air left the lungs of everyone within earshot. No second question followed. No follow-up about where or when. Just that stark, mathematical brutality. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was reverent. It was the silence of a church or a graveyard. because no one at that table would ever forget what those words meant. It meant she was the survivor, the witness, the keeper of the ghosts. She wasn't there to impress anyone. She wasn't there for medals or promotions or stories to tell around bonfires. She was there because that's what real leaders do. They come back, even when it hurts, even when they're broken, even when the body wants to quit and the world says don't bother. They come back. They return so the next generation knows how to stand. So the next generation knows what strength actually looks like. Because true strength doesn't wear a spotlight. It doesn't yell over the crowd like Private Huxley. It doesn't need your applause or your validation. It bleeds in silence. It trains without praise, and it stares down cowards until they remember what the word respect actually means. That night, no one made a toast. No one told Grace, "Thank you for your service." But they didn't have to. They showed up. They stayed. They listened. And for the first time since she had returned to the cold, hard ground of Fort Kessler, Sergeant Grace Mallerie didn't eat alone. Narrator outro. This has been a production of Military Stories. If this story of resilience and silent strength moved you, make sure to like and subscribe. True heroes walk among us, often unnoticed, bearing scars we cannot see. Until next time, remember, the loudest voice in the room is rarely the strongest.